Hey everyone, Card Cafe here with a new deck profile now that set 4 is finally here. It's time for a brand new set, which means brand new deck profiles and a bunch of new decks since now we are finally getting all of the Destined 1 units. So we're going to be talking about them. And first and foremost, with me, of course, as Dragon Empire is my favorite. We are starting off with the Dragon Empire Destined 1, which is the Destined 1 of Scales Aelquilibra. So this is an interesting one for me because first impressions of this deck were that I thought it was a little boring, if I'm being perfectly honest. But seeing it more in practice and getting to play it a little bit myself, I was intrigued by just kind of how aggressive it can be and just how much it pops off just really quick. Has been able to put on a lot of pressure to their opponent early. So I like that piece of it. I do like playing more aggressive aggro-y decks. And this really speaks to that. So I became more interested in, and here we are. So let's talk about it. Starting off with our ride line, of course. We got your grade 0, our 1 and our 2 here. So the grade 0, as always, is just your standard when wrote upon going second. You draw a card. Nothing really to talk about there. The grade 1, the first part of its skill is, I think, either almost exactly the same or verbatim the same effect as the Varga and Raziel grade 1 ride line cards, where when you wrote upon it with this specific grade 2, you get to call it to the rear guard if you would like. It is a may, you don't have to, but if you do, you soul charge 1. So you replace it in soul with another card, which is good because this deck uses a lot of soul. And then it can be an early game beater or booster, which is good. But then its second effect, once it's on the rear guard, is its overcharge effect, which is when it's targeted by Aelquilibra's effect, it gets an extra 10k, essentially, which is what most of the grade 1s do with the overcharge. Actually, I believe all of them do. We'll talk more about overcharge when we get to it, but it's an 18k booster when you're activating the overcharge ability plus a little bit extra power from the overcharge, so it gets to be a really big booster, and then can also just be an early game beater too. So pretty good card for the ride line. Grade 2 is pretty good as well when wrote upon by Aelquilibra specifically. You get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put any grade 3 or less card from among them. It doesn't require it to be a unit card. It can be whatever you want. You reveal that card, put it into your hand. If it's a unit with the overcharge ability, you soul charge 1. Again, good. You soul blast a lot in this deck, so the soul charge is good. You always almost want to be taking overcharge units, but you can take perfect guards, persona right copies, things that don't necessarily have it just to better fit your hand depending on the situation, but most of the time you want to take an overcharge unit for the soul charge. But then Aelquilibra himself, so he's got 2 effects. And it's honestly pretty straightforward. So the first one is an act once per turn. You soul blast 2, which is where all that soul is needed, because you're going to be doing this every turn. You choose 3 of your rear guards, and they get 5,000 power. And then if you chose 2 or more units that have the overcharge ability, he gets 10,000 power and you draw a card. So you really want to make sure you're choosing at least 2 units with the overcharge ability to give the 5k to, because then he gets bigger and you draw a card. More importantly, the draw card is the important part that you really want to make sure you're doing. And plus your overcharge units, you are always going to want to be targeting them anyway, depending on the situation, just because of how big they get when you pick them. So very straightforward. It's effectively soul blast 2, 3 units get 5k, he gets 10k and a draw. Very good effect. 10k draw is good. 5k to 3 units is good. Just a solid all-around effect. But then his divine skill is if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, so you can't do this until at the earliest turn 3 if you're going second, turn 4 if you go first. You can counterblast 1, and then you get to choose 2 of your rear guards and give an additional instance of 5,000 power. So you get to retarget 2 units with the overcharge effect ideally and activate their overcharge effects by giving them 5k. But then additionally, your opponent takes a damage directly if they are at less than 4 damage. And any trigger power, it gets minus 10k. So if they hit a defensive trigger on that check, they still get the effect, So if they have more damage than you, they'll heal. If it's a draw, they'll draw, so on and so forth. But they will not get that 10k power buff. That will be negated. Unfortunately, it's only 10k power. It doesn't negate over trigger power. For some reason, I don't know why it doesn't just negate all power gain from the trigger for that effect, but oh well. Just minus 10. So at least normal triggers don't get their defensive buff to their Vanguard. The effect's still going off though. I've had a few times when an opponent has checked a heal on that check, and while they didn't get the power, they still healed. So that part's annoying. But yeah, pretty straightforward, pretty simple, not really a lot to go over there, just 2 solid effects. Damage ping is always good, even if the effects still go off. Having then what would be 5 instances of giving 5k to your rear guards is also strong. That's just a whole board power up at that point. So that's strong. So simple and effective. And you can see where kind of this gets really aggressive and really fast is because you're just powering up a lot of your units and making them very big. That's kind of this deck's whole gimmick. Then we're running 3 Persona Ride copies. Not running the Grail or anything like that, just because we're running a Blitz Order Regalis piece, spoiler alert, because of the next card we're going to talk about. But you do want to make sure you have 3 Persona Rides, because Persona Rides are still very strong. But we are actually running 4 copies of Aelquilibra's specific order that I got in this set. Probably the best order that any of the Destined ones got. Next to maybe Letitia Fell's, the lyrical one, though I know a lot of people will disagree with that, but I think that order is pretty good. But anyway, what this card says. It's a grade 3 normal order. You play it with a Counterblast 1 if you have a Vanguard with Aelquilibra in its name. You get to pick 2 grade 3 or less units with different names with the overcharge ability from your drop, call them to rear guard. So, very simple effect, but it's a Counterblast 1, revive 2 rear guards. So that is very strong, especially in this meta where you have Varga is still a pretty potent deck running around blowing up your stuff, and also people just like targeting them to like just swinging into them, or like Shoujo Doji binding them and then forcing them to drop zone, what have you. This is just good to be able to play this Counterblast 1, revive 2 of them, because some of your overcharge units also just retire themselves for their effects. And so you can revive those as well if no one is retiring your stuff. So definitely just a 4 of a good way to just make sure you keep that board presence, because if you don't have the rear guards, if your rear guards get removed and you can't replace them, this deck loses all this pressure. This deck ride or dies by your rear guards being super big and swinging for massive numbers. So 4 copies to make sure you always have your rear guards. And then to round out, I am actually running 2 copies of the grade 3 overcharge unit. I know some people don't run this, some people do. Some run it like 1, 2. We've seen a couple run it at 3. I like the 2. Let's talk about why. So he has the overcharge effect, which is when he attacks, if you've chosen him with your Aelquilibra Vanguard's effect, you can Energy Blast 3, and he gets 15,000 power. And at the end of that battle, he retires himself and draws a card. So one of the cards that removes himself from the board. But the big thing is that power gain. So Aelquilibra gives him 5k from his effect, right? Then the overcharge gives him 15. So he's a 33k beater by himself, unboosted, no Persona Ride, no triggers. He's just straight 33. And then he also removes and draws himself a card. And him removing from the board is fine because we have this order. Now, the reason why we don't run more copies of this is because of the Energy Blast 3. Where there's another card that we will get to in a second who is competing for that Energy Blast 3 cost, as well as that front row rear guard circle. So they only run 2. He's really good for turn 3 is where this card shines if you're going first. Because the other card we'll talk about in a second can't do its Energy Blast 3 effect if you're going first on turn 3. So that's where this is really good to just be a huge beater to also get you a card back to hand for defense. So it's really good for that. Or if you just don't see that other card, just having him as your next best use of your energy and card to be attacking with in the front row. So I like 2 copies of him for that. He's worked out really well for me so far. Let's not beat around the bush anymore. Let's talk about the main attacker for this deck. And that is your main triple rare grade 2. So this guy, very strong card. His first effect is very simple, just the continuous. If you have 3 or more units with the overcharge ability, he just gets 5k. And that counts himself. He doesn't count, it's not one of those where he says you need 3 other units with the overcharge ability, just 3 units, so he counts himself. So just him and 2 more, which he'll pretty much always have, and he'll just get 5k. So that's nice. He's just a 15k beater by himself for that. If you target him with Aelquilibra, he's then a 20k beater by himself, which is nice. But the real reason he's here at 4 of is his second effect, which is his overcharge effect, which is a once per turn. When your grade 3 Vanguard attacks a grade 3 Vanguard, so you have to attack a grade 3 Vanguard, which is why this does not work on turn 3 going first. You Energy Blast 3, he restands with plus 10k power. So he's your multi-attack enabler. He's your restanding rearguard. Ideally, you have 2 of these on the rearguard circle on your push turn, like turn 4 with your Persona Ride turn. You've just pinged them a damage. You throw 2 of these down the front row, swing with your Vanguard, restand both of them for Energy Blast 6. They both get 10,000 power. Swing again for massive numbers. So that's your big push to try and end the game. Also just gets really big because, again, on that restand, he's getting 10. If you target him with Aelquilibra and his own effect, he's got 10, so he's a 30k beater by himself, not even counting what he's being boosted for, which are going to be really big, and we'll talk about once we get to the grade 1s. But again, not really much to say there, just it's a restanding rearguard that gets big. So 4 of. Next, Hanover Flex, we're running 2 Brachioforce. This is kind of for the help in the early game, get a little pressure going in the early game, as well as a little spot removal to force your opponent to have to decide if they're going to take the damage or allow this to retire a rearguard. You don't really have any other retire in this deck, so this kind of just helps put on that pressure, and also retires himself to draw a card if he hits, so it also just replaces himself that way. He's not an overcharge unit, but if you are in a situation where you haven't seen this grade 2, it's not the end of the world, because Aelquilibra doesn't have to target overcharge units for that 5k effect. It can target any unit, so it can give Brachioforce 5k, and you just need to target 2 overcharge units for the 10k and draw. So if you have 2 like grade 1 rear guards and this, you can target both of those overcharge units for Aelquilibra's effect, and then target this, and it'll still be 5, and I'll be 15 hitting for better numbers. So I like him for that. Good early game card. 2 of. He's not an overcharge unit, so I'm not really comfortable running more than 2, but he's good for that tech. And then the Regalis piece, we are running Twin Cast. Probably the best Blitz Order Regalis piece right now. For anyone who doesn't know what it does, when you play it from hand, it's a 10k shield, essentially. But then it has an additional effect that from the drop zone, you can remove it from the game and be a 15k shield. So it lets you guard twice. It guards as a 10k shield and then guards as a 15k shield. So 25k shield across the board, but that can be used twice. That's the big thing. So really good card just to add that extra defense we like to see. Next, long list of grade 1s. We got a lot of grade 1s in here because this is where the rest of our overcharge units as well as some other important cards. So first is the double rare boy, probably the most important card after the restander, honestly. In the games where I haven't seen this, I've lost. And that's because he has a very simple effect, which is just when he's placed on rearguard, so long as you have 2 or more units with the overcharge ability, you counterblast 1, draw a card, soul charge 1. So the draw is nice, but actually the more important effect there is the soul charge. Because as we said, Aelquilibra Soul Blast 2 for its main effect, and you're doing that every turn. So you really have to make sure you're maintaining your soul count, and this is the main way you do that. Is by just playing this down, counterblasting 1, soul charge 1. And you can do that every time you play it from hand, or if you play it with this, it is not restricted to being played from hand. You can just do that one place from anywhere, so you can use this, call this, use its effect again, and just cycle it that way. So really good card. It lets you draw cards, lets you soul charge to keep up that momentum. And then its secondary effect is its overcharge ability, which is the same as the other grade ones, which is when he's chosen by Aelquilibra's effect, he gets an additional 10k power. So it becomes a 23k booster. So when you combine that with our restanding boy, your numbers are just massive. That's like 53 between the two of them, not even counting persona rides or anything else. So just great numbers to hit. And so 4 of for sure. It's an overcharge unit. It draws a card. It soul charges. You have to run 4 of this. We also just have the room because we don't have a ton of overcharge units yet. Next, the other really important grade 1 overcharge unit, who is only a rare, but I guess they only have so many spots, but definitely a 4 of. So this one's whole effect is actually just their overcharge effect. Which is when it boosts, if it's been chosen by Aelquilibra's effect, it gets 10k power, just like all the other ones. But at the end of the battle, if you have not countercharged this turn, you can retire her to countercharge 1. So this is your main countercharge engine, excuse me. You have a good amount of counterblast you're using, not a ton, but a good amount, because Aelquilibra's divine skills a counterblast, and then the order costs counterblast 1, and ideally you're using that close to every turn. So you just can sometimes get up there and counterblast again, because also the grade 1 that we just talked about is a counterblast for its effect. So you can go through a good amount of counterblast depending on what order you're seeing your units. So definitely 4 of this just for being an overcharge unit and being your countercharger. So 100% 4 of. Pretty straightforward. That's one thing, is like not a lot to talk about with these cards because it's pretty obvious what is good about them. They're pretty short and self-explanatory. But let's get into our tech choices. So we are running 2 copies of the Dancing Princess of Elegant Flames from last set. So this is the generic order searcher that all the nations got. This is Dragon Empire's version. So for those who don't know, it's just when it's placed from hand, you discard a card and then search for a normal order from your deck, put it to drop zone, and that turn you can play it from your drop zone. If you do, it goes to the bottom of the deck. So this is just to guarantee that you see this order. It's just really important to keep up, like I said, the momentum. You really want to make sure your board is full, and even when you're with the rear guards that are retiring themselves, like the counter charge or the grade 3, or if the grade 1 that draws a card and soul charges gets removed, you're calling that back to use it again. So you really just want to make sure you're using this order. So we want to make sure we see this order. So we're running 2 copies of her. Pretty self-explanatory. Next, 2 copies of Shinri. This should be more. I'm not even going to try and explain it away. I just don't have more copies of her. I waited a little too long to grab them, and then they got bought out. So might be, but 2 copies is still good. You still see her a good amount because you draw a good amount of cards. And for everyone who doesn't know what Shinri does, she's like also simple but very effective. Just when she boosts, if you have either played an order or if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards, she gets 5k. At the end of the battle, if she goes to soul, draw a card. So good in this deck because 1, you're playing a normal order almost every turn, and 2, she goes to soul. So she's another way to help fuel the soul, draw a card. Really good card, 13k booster as well. Usually you're putting her behind the Vanguard. So yeah, definitely recommend more copies of this, I'm working on getting more. But for right now, 2 is fine. I'll probably cut 1 copy of like Dancing Flame to run a 3rd one, and then kind of figure out from there. Next, another generic I do actually highly recommend is the Cat. I am running 2 because 20k shields are hugely important right now, as they have always been for a while, but it just keeps getting more and more true. Partly because of this deck. With how big this deck gets, the mirror match can be scary and you want bigger shield cards. So I am running 2 copies of the Cat. For anyone who doesn't know, this is the generic that came out back in like set 12 of Overdress for all nations. That just says when it's placed on rear guard or when placed in the Guardian Circle, you take 2 cards from your ride line, put them back into the ride line face up, and then either it's a 20k shield on the Guardian Circle for that effect, or has a specific effect when placed on rear guard. In this case, you draw a card. That doesn't come up super often. You're almost never going to use it for that. It's here for the 20k shield. to try and make sure you don't die. So I highly recommend it for that because it is scary out there. There's lots of really big attacks that every nation seems to have these days. And lastly, just as always, of course, we are running the Perfect Guards, 3 nation, 1 Sanctitude. Nation Perfect Guards, you don't have to discard for the cost of the Perfect Guard. If you have 1 or less card in hands, and Sanctitude is Sanctitude. If the opponent's Vanguard has the text triple drive, you don't discard. And if they have some sort of guard restrict from hand, Sanctitude gets around it because it goes to the order zone, not to Guardian Circle. So, good card. You're always just running that lineup, except for very specific instances. Triggers should not surprise anybody, but it is for crits. 8 crit, excuse me. 4 of the special crit, which I do recommend, just because for emergency soul charge, if you really need it. If you see that you're going to be short on soul for your next turn, but you have a copy of this in your hand, you might want to throw it down like behind the Vanguard or something to shove it into soul, so that you keep up your soul count. Really, it's for the emergency situation. Ideally, you're not doing that, but it's if you have to, you need to, and this can save you from being in a situation where you don't have soul. Because if you don't have the soul to use Aelquilibra's effect, you lose. You just, all your pressure goes out the window. So I do recommend the go to soul crits for that. For the off trigger, I've been going back and forth on this. But for the moment, I am running draws. Your pieces are very important. Like the grade 2 restander, you really need to make sure you see that. The grade 1 that soul charges and draws, you really need to see that. So drawing cards is good. So we run the draw trigger, try and draw into those pieces. However, like I've been talking about, 20k shields are also really important. And not for nothing, even though my rear guards are already getting really big, hitting a front just makes them even bigger and just even more impossible to guard. So there's that. But really the argument for the fronts is the 20k shield, just to make sure I don't die. And you do have a good amount of draw power. Aelquilibra is drawing you a card every turn. The grade 1 is drawing you a card. Shinri is drawing you a card. So and that grade 3 is drawing you a card. So there's a good amount of draw power in this deck. It just not necessarily enough sometimes because, again, it's so piece reliant. It's the main thing with this deck. So I'm doing draws for now. I think I'm going to keep playing around with it because I think there's pros and cons to both, honestly. And if you prefer fronts, go for it. I don't think it's a bad idea. Heals. I am back to my classic. I am doing 2 generic heals and then 1 each of the crit and restand heals. The Stride decks are kind of phased out of the meta right now. Shiranui and Luard aren't quite as potent. They're still good, but you're just not seeing them as much anymore. But you're seeing just all sorts of restanding, all sorts of crits. And then there's Sojo Doji running around, which doesn't have anything. So 2 generic heals for that, just for all situations. But I definitely recommend 1 of each, at least of the restand and the crit, just because most decks are doing 1 of the 2. Either they're getting a crit or they're restanding or they're doing both. So definitely make sure you at least have 1 of each of these. But yeah. Overtrigger reveal. What are we doing? It's a Dragon Empire deck. So we're running the Dragon Empire OT. It's really strong. Being able to restand your Vanguard is just so strong. Even though Aelquilibra doesn't really have a way to take advantage of that, it's still a restanding Vanguard. You're still getting in 4 drives total at that point. You're never not going to do that. Like it's just what you do. If for some reason you don't have the Dragon Empire OT, any of the generics honestly are fine. Blue is fine. Purple's not fantastic because you're always going to have a full front row. Yellow's kind of funny, I guess, just because you don't really have much retire, so you could just wipe out someone's board unexpectedly. So if you were going to do anything, I'd maybe recommend yellow just for some cheeky board removal. or blue. It would be one of those two, yellow or blue. Just because blue was always good, but honestly, it should be this. Restanding Vanguards kind of just trump everything else. So that's what we're doing. And that's Aelquilibra. So yeah, like I said, it's pretty simple. There's not a lot of thinking that you need to do, which can be a pro or a con depending on who you are and kind of what day you're having, which is kind of where I'm at. Like some days I want to play a more like combo heavy thinkier deck. Some days I want a deck that I can kind of just autopilot a little bit. And that's this deck. This deck is very straightforward. It's a helmet deck. You're throwing down your units early. You're making them really big immediately. And you're just punching your opponent in the face really hard, which can be fun. It can be entertaining to see your opponent's face when you tell them what the number is that you're swinging with while they're at grade 2. And you're swinging for like 43. And that's always entertaining. So I do like that about this deck. I think it's definitely solid right now just for that fact of just how hard you can hit your opponent really quickly. Set 5, it gets even better because then we're getting that really good grade 2 triple rare. That's a Searcher, which will definitely help find your pieces. So that's huge. So the end of the deck is definitely a contender right now. I don't know that it's like a top contender, but I would definitely put it competitive. It's tier 1.5, tier 2, depending on how you viewed the tiers. You can definitely do well with this deck just because of how fast it is. So that's it for me. Always happy to chat about questions or concerns or thoughts about what cards to run. So if you have any, please put them in the comments below. Thanks. Bye.